What I'm going to say will, in a lot of ways, continue the points that Partha Chatterjee has just made. The public intellectual is usually thought of as someone who voices the general interest of the public. Even when he or she takes a partisan or sectional position in a particular debate, the intellectual is still making a case that is relevant to the concerns of the general public. In other words, the classic figure of the public intellectual is someone who upholds a universal point of view based on knowledge whose scope is universal. In terms of our own academic or professional training, such an intellectual could be an economist or lawyer or physicist or humanist. It would make no difference, because in the public arena, she would have to engage in debate with others, not according to the discursive rules of her own professional discipline, but those of a universal field of public knowledge. Therefore, when we speak of the historian as a public intellectual, we cannot mean the intellectual in this universal sense. We must think of a more specific intellectual who brings his or her expert knowledge acquired in the course of years of study and research in the discipline of history to bear on debates taking place in a public arena outside the professional forums of historians. What are the terms in which the historian might engage in such debates? With what consequences? Those are the questions we must discuss today. The distinction between the specialized practice of historians and the cultivation of universal knowledge emerged in the 19th century and solidified in the 20th with the professionalization of the discipline of history in Europe and the United States. The rise of history departments in universities, the organization of archives accessible to historians, the founding of specialized history journals and professional associations of historians institutionalized the distinction by establishing protocols of research, modes of presentation, and forms of debate that were regulated by historians themselves. Historical truth was henceforth to be authenticated by and only by historians. They did not have to appeal to any authority but themselves. How could historians then participate as historians in an arena of public debate where truth claims, even when those were claims about history, were not necessarily adjudicated by their professional peers? To answer this question from the location of India would, I think, bring out features that are no longer apparent in the professional experience of historians in the West. History as a professionalized academic discipline has fully come into its own in India only since the middle of the 20th century. The relation between the academic discipline and the wider public is being negotiated there in ways that might seem startlingly different from those with which Western historians are familiar. Let me describe some of these ways. A major public debate in which Indian historians have been embroiled relates to allegations of destruction of Hindu places of worship and forcible conversions to Islam during the centuries when various parts of the subcontinent were ruled by Muslim kings. Right-wing Hindu nationalists today deploy this historical material in the service of a politics of blaming Muslims and seeking retribution. Many historians have joined this debate to point out, with carefully researched historical evidence, that just as there are instances of Muslim conquerors destroying Hindu temples, so are there instances of them patronizing Hindu religious establishments. The motives were more strategic than bigoted. Further, religious intolerance was not limited to Muslims alone, because Hindu rulers are known to have persecuted Buddhists and Jains, just as there were violent conflicts between Hindu religious sects. Again, the bulk of the conversions to Islam in India were not forced by Muslim rulers, but carried out by Sufi preachers. Most of those converted were from the lowly and socially oppressed, artisanal and laboring castes of Hindu society. The historian's case is that the charge that 7 centuries of Muslim rule was unrelieved tyranny, whose memory is still weighing down on the Hindus, is an ideological construct motivated by a hateful politics and is unsupported by historical facts. When historians make this claim, they are in fact asserting that in this public debate about what happened in history, they are, by virtue of their expert knowledge, in a better position than others to judge the matter. The relevant historical facts have been evaluated and established in the appropriate academic forums. Historians are now bringing those facts to the attention of the general public so that erroneous stories in popular circulation could be corrected. When challenged on their facts, historians frequently respond that such disputes cannot be settled in newspaper columns or television talk shows. The proper place for debate on sources and analysis of evidence is the academic conference or professional journal. If their critics retort by charging that those 45 disciplinary spaces are jealously guarded by an elite corps of liberal secular professors, the historians answer that it is the rabble-rousing publicists who are spawning ideology. The historians are only concerned with the critically verified truth. There is, of course, a conceit involved in the historian's claim that her expert knowledge is uncontaminated by ideology. As Michel de Certeau pointed out for European history, what had once appeared as explicitly ideological commitments in older dynastic chronicles and religious histories were taken out of the final product and inserted into the process of production of academic histories as questions of methodology. That was the maneuver that turned ideological storytelling into scientific history. Something like this happened in India too in the course of the 20th century. An older social history marked by the contentious sectarian, caste, ethnic, and linguistic politics of the colonial period and written mainly in the various Indian languages was displaced by the new academic histories produced in the universities and written in English. What resulted was a hierarchy in historical knowledge. Academic history in the English language occupied the high ground to proclaiming a truth validated by its self-regulating disciplinary institutions, but the old social history in the Indian languages survived outside the academy, seeking validation from the public domain of cultural politics. As long as the line between the two histories was clearly maintained and the hierarchy respected, the historian's claim to expert knowledge might have enjoyed greater credibility in public debates. But with the rapid expansion of higher education in the 1960s and 70s, the disciplinary boundaries could no longer be effectively policed. The key to disciplinary autonomy was the ability to turn ideological disputes into questions of methodology. But the proliferation of universities meant that history departments soon became entangled in the regional, linguistic, caste, and religious conflicts of electoral politics. The old social history that had been consigned outside the academy made its way into the portals of the university, entering the list of monographs and textbooks, claiming recognition as a less elitist and more democratic form of knowledge. Deprived of the habitual protection of their professional protocols, many historians feel immobilized by the assault on their expert knowledge launched by the practitioners of cultural politics. Showing scant regard for disciplinary conventions, the latter write histories unsupported by material or archival evidence, often claiming nothing more than an adherence to popular memory and the residual sediment of collective experience. The historian's predicament was highlighted when many of them testified in court in the most publicized and contentious legal battle of recent times over claims to the site of a 16th century mosque destroyed in 1992 by a Hindu right-wing mob. When cross-examined on their views on whether the mosque had been built on the foundations of a Hindu temple, historians and archaeologists were shown little respect for their concern with disciplinary methods. However, the exposure of historians to the rough and tumble and even the occasional nastiness of public debate can have a regenerative effect on the profession. After all, innovations in the discipline of history have rarely come as a purely endogenous development. The rise of social history in Europe was a result of the historian's encounter with working class politics. Feminist history, minority history, aboriginal history, subaltern history, all were responses to movements in the public domain claiming to give voice to those who had been left out by conventional history. With varying degrees of success, historians sought to turn the ideological thrust of those movements into methodological innovations in their discipline by searching for records that had been lost or ignored, going beyond the written word to oral and visual sources, allowing for the historical interpretation of legends, myths, artifacts, and performance, going as far as acknowledging the constructed nature of history itself. There is no reason to believe that by opening the historian's truth to scrutiny by an external public, the discipline would be irreparably harmed. After all branches of knowledge, history has been probably the most complicit with hegemonic constructions of state ideology. Exposure to public debate, even when these are driven by a hateful and violent politics, can force the historian to become aware of the ideological assumptions hidden behind his or her own methodological commitments. That is not an opportunity that normally arises for many other disciplines of knowledge. Thank you.